Okay, hey folks, we are almost done our Ancient Egypt unit, but we're going to finish off by looking at some of the influential pharaohs of Egypt. And of course, if you remember from the eras lesson, technically they're not called pharaohs until the New Kingdom, but we will just refer to them all as pharaohs because it sounds cooler. So we're really looking at the big question of how can we evaluate and rank the influence of some of Egypt's major leaders. So I do want you to be thinking, because we're going to talk today together about one, and then you're going to do a source evaluation on another one. But then you yourself are going to look through a bunch of different pharaohs of Egypt. So I want you to be thinking about what kind of criteria can you use to judge the leadership of influential leaders in general, and then use some of that criteria for ancient Egypt. So obviously things like cultural legacy could come into play, military expansion, economic prosperity, happiness of the people, peace, trade relations, anything like that that you think might contribute to whether or not a leader, or in this case a pharaoh, is good or not so good. So we are going to start with a case study on Akhenaten. And Akhenaten is one of the few pharaohs of Egypt who is very controversial. For the most part, Egypt is very stable and they have a very strong legacy that is continuous, and that's kind of the question we've been addressing this whole unit, really. Akhenaten stands out because he does things that other pharaohs simply don't do. I mean, other pharaohs are good and bad at various things, but for the most part, they all rule in virtually the same way. They all want to connect to the ideas of Ma'at. They all want order, balance, harmony. They keep the same gods. Akhenaten does things that are very different. In terms of who he is, he's a New Kingdom pharaoh. He comes to power at a time when there's a very large empire. He has a 17-year reign. He's the son of Amenhotep III, who was a very prominent, very good pharaoh. He had very good foreign relations, very good foreign policy. Something called the Amarna letters were very significant during his time. And Akhenaten very legitimately inherits the throne from his father. So at the time of Akhenaten's rule, the New Kingdom was at its peak in terms of wealth, power, foreign relations, world status. Again, you're looking at a fairly early time period. 1362 BCE is when he falls out of power, but you are looking at a very significant time in Egyptian history. Why is there controversy around this guy? This is what we're going to be focusing on today. But some of the highlights that we're going to be looking at are the fact that he creates this crazy religious reform. As we know in ancient Egypt, you guys looked at religion all of last week, the religion is part of what keeps Egypt so stable for such a long time, because the people love their lives. They want to carry those lives on into the afterlife. They do that through mummification, through rituals, through all of those kinds of things. And a lot of that centers on the gods, and the gods maintain their status throughout Egyptian society. It really is unchanging, as is Egyptian religion in general. What Akhenaten does is he creates a whole new religion, and this, as you might imagine, could have caused major upheaval in Egypt were the people not such a peaceful people in general. And we'll talk about that. So he creates a new cult, or a new religion that is centered around the god, the Aten, and the Aten is a god that he creates. He also closes all of the temples to all the other gods in Egypt. So if you were someone whose family, supported Hathor or Ra or anyone else, you suddenly had to worship the Aten and no other god but the Aten. All the other temples were closed. He also forbid the worship of the other gods. So obviously that's something that's hard to control in people's personal homes, but he did enforce it on a national level. He had his police, his military, going out, wandering the streets, enforcing this law where people had to worship the Aten. He also confiscated all of the possessions of all the other gods and all of the other temples, gave them to himself, his royal family, and the Aten. He also created a new hymn to the Aten, which was the only religious text. So no more mummification, no more Book of the Dead, no more any of that stuff, only the hymn to the Aten. This, obviously, it's a translation, you can tell by the language, but if you kind of pause the video here and you read through, you can see that it's all about the Aten being the sole god, the sole creator of everything on earth. obviously Catholics, Christians, monotheistic religions of today saw this and they thought, oh my gosh, Akhenaten is the first leader in history to realize that there is only one God at a time when you've got the Mesopotamians with thousands of gods, Egyptians with thousands of gods, eventually Greeks and Romans have thousands of gods, of course not during the time of Akhenaten. It's a little bit too early for that, but they recognize Akhenaten as the first man who truly gets it. He sees that there is only one God. This is, as Egyptologists point out, kind of an exaggeration, but it is that idea, certainly for religious people, very religious people, that perhaps Akhenaten was the first to think in this monotheistic way rather than a polytheistic way. In terms of his name, because let's look a little bit at how he makes this happen. In year 4 of his reign, so fairly early on, he changes his name from Amenhotep the fourth, which is connected to the god Amun, meaning Amun is content, to Akhenaten, living spirit of the Aten, he who serves the Aten. And if you think back to the lesson on religion and discussing the 5 parts of the human body, the name was a very key component to who you are. So even the fact that he changes his name from his given name Amenhotep, connected to the god Amun, to Akhenaten, connected to this god he created, the Aten, is very significant. This is a visual here of the Aten, this non-anthropomorphic sun disk that he creates. Looks nothing like any other Egyptian god. There's no face, there's no body, it's just a sun disk with hands. Very strange for the Egyptian people. In year 6, he also creates a new capital city very far from the major urban centers, right around here, Akhet Aten, meaning place of the glory of the Aten or horizon of the Aten, a complete break from pharaonic tradition. So depending on who your family was, very often families at the time were ruling in Thebes, but depending on where your family came to power, yes, the capital city often shifted, but moving the capital city into the middle of nowhere was basically unheard of. And this definitely showcased the fact that Akhenaten did not care about the people of Egypt. He didn't want to hear about their problems. He didn't want them coming to him. He wanted to separate himself, and that's certainly another part of why he is so controversial. In terms of whether this really was monotheism and whether he was the first monotheist in history, most Egyptologists say that that's not entirely true, simply because the cult of the Aten, yes, is worshipping only one god, but it also demands the worship of the entire pharaoh family. So you worship Akhenaten, you worship his wife Nefertiti, you worship his son. One of his sons is King Tutankhamun. So it's really a version of polytheism still, because you're not just worshiping one god, you're worshiping one god and an entire pharaonic family. So that's very important. Art in this time period is also very important. It is a complete break, again, from Egyptian tradition. And another thing that throughout the 3,000 years of Egypt, aside from the 17 years of Akhenaten, it is a very consistent, stable artwork. You have very little shift in terms of sculpture, in terms of realism, or anything like that. Under Akhenaten, he insists on a more realistic portrayal of himself, not idealistic, and shows himself in very tender embraces. So you can see here, just in terms of sculpture, that you go from a kind of young, idealistic form in a pharaonic sculpture to someone where you are looking a little older. You don't have that kind of typical ideal, at least in terms of the Egyptians, young form, in terms of that masculine body. You do have also a very, most people point out, kind of feminine look to Akhenaten. Large hips, a rounded belly, all of these kind of forms that seem to be more female than anything else. You can see even with the face, the lips are larger, the nose is longer, the face itself is longer. Perhaps that is more realistic than what we see on the left. Certainly in terms of the Egyptian people, perhaps more realistic, but still a complete break, and interesting that he chooses to make this break. And then here you can see some more sculptures of the face and the body. Total break from tradition. In terms of family portraiture as well, the fact that he shows himself in these tender and loving family portraits and embraces is very different. You would never see this from a pharaoh before or after him. The fact that you see him here kissing his children, who, yes, look a little bit alien-esque with their large heads, but kissing his children, his wife shown with him. You've got kind of wrinkles in his neck. You've got a little bit of a pot belly here. Not idealistic, very tender form, very non-Egyptian, really, up until this point. And of course, you have the Aten up here with its outstretched hands, giving the Ankh, which is the Ankh of life, to each member of the royal family. He also creates the temple to the Aten, which is a temple that's all open air, open concept. There's no roof because it's all about worshiping the sun's rays. And you can see that again here in these reconstructions. None of this remains because after Akhenaten's death, people were like, that guy was crazy. Let's get rid of everything he did. In terms of military expansion, he uses his military forces to enforce his new religion. He closes temples with them. He ignores foreign relations. He ignores threats from the Hittites and the Assyrians. All the energy is focused on the new religion. So if you're thinking about leadership and the importance of military expansion, something you might want to look at when you're thinking at Akhenaten. Same thing with the government. He replaces all of the officials with new ones. Often they were corrupt because he didn't look into them. He didn't really care. He took the old economy, which was run by the priests of Amun, and again, Amun is no longer a god, so he replaces them with local admin, local officials that control the economy. He ignores the concerns of the Egyptian people. So even though you still have a stable government because you've still got one king that everyone is listening to, it's not good government policy that Akhenaten is running with. Part of the important thing here is that the Egyptian people were such a peaceful people and they believed so strongly in their gods that they just thought, Akhenaten is in place because of something we have done. We are not going to rebel against him. He is our king god now and we are going to listen to what he says. Once he dies, they go back on that, but certainly they do listen to him while he is in power. I'm not going to read through all of this, but there is also controversy around his wife Nefertiti and whether or not she possibly was ruling during his time, and whether he maybe was not totally capable of ruling, and that's why she rules possibly. I'm also not going to read through all this, but you can pause and see there's a lot of questions maybe about the fact that Akhenaten was so strange because he had some sort of an illness, perhaps connected to the feminine qualities, showing a genetic abnormality. Some people have linked it to something called Marfan syndrome. A lot of people also question whether or not this was just symbolic, the changes that were happening, at least artistically, in terms of the Aten being the mother and the father of humankind. Therefore, Akhenaten wanted to show himself in both sort of female-esque and male forms together. But there definitely are questions about whether or not some sort of an illness was responsible for Akhenaten's very strange departure from Egyptian tradition. The aftermath, and this is where Tutankhamun comes into play. Otherwise, he's not a very influential pharaoh other than in terms of cultural legacy, which for sure he's influential in. The aftermath of Akhenaten is called the Great Restoration period, and this is the period that who we know as Tutankhamun, was once Tutankhaten, changes his name from Aten back to Amun, representing his grandfather, and removes his father's name from all of the records. He was a very young king, so probably his administration was doing this, not Tutankhamun himself. But definitely during Tutankhamun's time, it was the restoration period, and he creates the restoration decree, destroys all of the connections to Akhet-Aten, to Akhenaten, uses all of those materials for new architectures, and returns the capital to Thebes. So you have this very strange 17-year period where Akhenaten tries, it seems, to completely change Egyptian traditions, completely change everything about the Egyptian way of life that has been so stable. Luckily, the Egyptian people are so stable that after that 17 years, they just go back to what they had before and pretend like nothing happened and try to destroy all evidence of something happening before. So now I want you guys to look through some of the other pharaohs of Egypt. First, take a look at the Hatshepsut case study, and then take a look at some of the other well-known pharaohs and see what you can gather. Okay?